the appropriate response to that? Is a cyber response offensive the appropriate response, or other type of military action? We haven't gotten to that point yet. Of course, Estonia is probably the most illustrative case of what I consider to be an act of war against another nation. But in my view, it's going to happen at some point. And just like with 9/11, we saw the warning signs. I think we're going to have a cyber attack at some point. And I think, General, that's an excellent question in terms of how do we as nation states respond to what is an act of warfare if it is sponsored by another nation state.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt.
Yep. It's an interesting question. I think the first reaction is, as long as we have the nation states involved, ensure that their laws and practices all conform and they no longer provide a criminal safe haven, we have to respect the sovereignty of the nations that have the ability to prosecute these, making sure we have the international cooperation piece going there, making sure that we're exchanging the information relative to how do we collect evidence, as I mentioned earlier. But there's another component, and I believe, I think at least 3 of my colleagues to the left mentioned that we have to deconstruct this. If we continue to lump everything into one big category and call it cybersecurity, our ability to successfully investigate and prosecute at the nation-state level is going to be very challenged. There's cybercrime issues. There's some norms of behavior in cyberspace that we need to look after. There's economic espionage, and these are all not the same thing. So we need to make sure we have to separate those out, then have the ability to go ahead and successfully prosecute those in the individual nations.
Yes.
Sure. Just a brief comment. I think courts serve their purpose, but I think as we develop our strategies to address the cyber threat unpacked, we have to look at ways that we can address it without ever having to end up in court.
Thank you. Let me mention that John Rose has graciously noted that we will capture all the questions that have been passed up to me here, because there are some really outstanding ones, and we're not going to be able to address all of them, but we will make record of those and post those, so at least you can see the types of questions that are on the audience's mind out here today. You know, on this, the international law perspective, not too long ago, as a matter of fact, it was just several months ago, I believe, there was an individual, an American, who was tried and convicted for a number of very large cyber crimes, probably millions and perhaps billions of dollars of criminal activity. Of course, he worked with other members in other nations of the world, but he was sentenced here in Boston court not too long ago, and in fact, he got 20 years. And I think those are the kind of realities that we need to make known out there for those who are attempting or thinking about maybe a life of cybercrime or cyber mischief like that, because it really costs a lot of grief and it can cost lives when they conduct this type of activity. So 20 years, and I think we need to publicize that type of activity. Let me ask the panel members now, here's another question. And this might have an interesting perspective from the various areas that they come from, the various nations they come from. What's your nightmare scenario? In other words, the event that you fear the most that could result in devastating impact to your nation or the population or society or trade. Who would like to address that issue, the nightmare, all right? Congressman McCaul.
We have a lot of nightmares about this topic, but obviously a denial of service attack that shuts down power grids and we have major blackouts across the country would cause major devastation. But I think if I had to really pinpoint the greatest fear I have is that the internet cable is a physical thing. It's not virtual. And it is all across the world, and it is exposed off the coast of Egypt. That could be physically attacked and would shut down the internet. That's one of the vulnerabilities that I've been briefed upon that I think gave me the greatest pause. But certainly a denial of service attack an act of warfare, a nation-state act of warfare to shut us down is a great fear.
Thank you. Comments? Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, I think, I guess what I would call the nightmare scenarios where you have some sort of a physical event, where it's a natural disaster, whether it's a direct attack, that you're somehow, because of a cyber insecurity, not have the ability to communicate and be able to direct the emergency response we need to have out there. As far as as far as a single incident that could take place, that's probably the one I worry about the most, because that has the biggest impact on things going wrong.
I have some experience in that area, as a matter of fact. That inability to communicate, and Mr. Quigley mentioned that during his comments, that was a terrifying event in itself, in the fact that on 9/11, everyone in Washington, D.C., who relies so much on their cell phones, they couldn't communicate. And I think that started around 9:30 in the morning and lasted until about 6 o'clock that night. And the same was the case in New York City. And it's amazing how much we do rely on our cell phone connectivities these days, and the ability to communicate. I know that we thought that one of the terrorist aircraft might be targeted for our U.S. Congress and our Capitol Hill. And so the congressional members were asked to vacate the building. And of course, we were making sure that the continuity of our government would be in place, because the President of the United States was flying that day. The Vice President was in the basement of the White House and was in some danger. And then, of course, the next areas of succession flow into our Capitol Hill. And it was very trying for us to know that people were out on the street with their cell phones trying to communicate, and we weren't able to contact them, they weren't able to contact us. So, Mr. Schmidt, your comments about that, we take it so much for granted these days, but when it is taken away from you, the pain is there, as Mr. Quigley noted, in trying to ensure the safety of his members in New York City. Any other comments on that? Yes, Patrick.
Well, a real nightmare situation for a member of government could be that if something like that happens again, like happened in 2007 in Estonia, and there is a major cyber attack against a NATO member country, and when that country comes to the conclusion that it wants to activate NATO Article 5, and the member states of NATO can't agree to that, that could lead to a consequence where the whole world's security structures are under the question. So this is my nightmare.
Very good. Mr. Baker?
Yes, well, you know, I think we can have nightmares about things that can go wrong. The worst ones are the things that we know could go wrong and we really don't have the capacity to respond. And I think just as a public servant, when I look at critical government operations, our general lack of redundancy and capability to recover is frightening.
Mr. Pellew.
Yes. Yes. I live in a world of nightmares. In fact, I'm in charge of the Cyber Defense Agency in France, and I'm paid to imagine nightmares. So, and you can't imagine, even each subject to take is a nightmare. Electricity, the power grids, transportation, airplanes, water supply, I don't know, finance, banking system, health system. Look. For example, we always forget that subject. How much an hospital today depends on IT system, even an X-ray system. All of that are computers. So, in fact, my biggest nightmare is that we didn't have enough time to prepare us to the nightmare. That is my biggest nightmare.